30,000 feet above the Atlantic, on a private jet built for power and privilege. A single whisper lit the spark of a storm. Honestly, I just don't feel comfortable with him sitting up front. Those words, dripping with prejudice, weren't spoken in a boardroom or a courtroom. They were whispered on a luxury flight, directed at a man in a tailored suit, a black CEO who had paid for his seat, only to be quietly told he did not belong. But what the crew and the entitled passenger didn't know was the man they tried to humiliate was no ordinary passenger. He was Elijah Cross, the billionaire founder of NovaSphere Analytics, a man who had the power to reshape industries with a single decision. What happens when casual racism collides with absolute power at 30,000 feet? What happens when a moment meant to shame instead ignites a chain of consequences that will dismantle careers, collapse empires, and rewrite the future of an entire airline? This is not just a story about prejudice. It is a story about justice in the sky. Before we begin, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that matter. The cabin was quiet in that rare, expensive way only a private jet can provide. Soft leather seats gleamed under muted lighting. Polished wood reflected the faint glow of reading lamps. The low hum of the auxiliary power unit gave the air a steady rhythm, a heartbeat for the aircraft. Everything about the space spoke of privilege, comfort, control. And then came the words, "Caroline, I just don't feel comfortable with him sitting up front." They were spoken in a low, conspiratorial tone, a whisper, but one that carried enough venom to pierce the silence like a needle. Elijah Cross didn't look up from his tablet, though the words had been aimed squarely at him. His seat, 1A, the first and most private spot in the cabin, was no longer just a chair. In that moment, it became a stage. On one side, a wealthy white man voicing the kind of casual racism that dripped with entitlement. On the other, a black CEO, a man who had spent his life navigating spaces where his presence was treated as anomaly, intrusion, or mistake. The speaker was Richard Langston, a legacy client of Skylux Aviation, someone the crew clearly knew well. He had boarded the plane late, his voice booming, his manner entitled. Now he leaned close to Caroline Meyer, the lead flight attendant, dropping his poison with a half smile as if sharing a private joke. But Elijah wasn't laughing. He was 43 years old, dressed in a navy suit cut sharp but understated. He had learned long ago that his presence drew enough attention without the need for extravagance. He carried himself with stillness, a quiet weight that many mistook for aloofness. In truth, it was discipline. A discipline forged in boardrooms where he had to fight twice as hard to be heard, on golf courses where deals were made, but where invitations rarely came his way, in stores where clerks shadowed him until they realized he could buy the place outright. This flight mattered. In 7 hours, in Geneva, he was scheduled to finalize NovaSphere Analytics' acquisition of a Swiss robotics firm. The deal was worth billions and would cement NovaSphere's dominance in predictive AI for years to come. He had boarded the plane early, appreciating the rare solitude of a chartered flight. One passenger, one seat, his sanctuary at 35,000 feet. Or so he thought. Elijah had chosen seat 1A for its privacy. It wasn't about prestige. It was about space to think, to plan, to center himself before stepping into negotiations where every word and every pause carried weight. For 20 minutes, he had that sanctuary. For 20 minutes, he had peace. Then Richard Langston arrived. Langston was the kind of man Elijah had encountered his entire life. late 50s, florid face, silver hair swept back like he believed the world owed him a breeze. He wore wealth casually, golf shirt and slacks that cost more than most people's rent, and he carried the smug ease of a man used to doors opening before he even knocked. When Langston saw Elijah in seat 1A, something flickered across his face. Not shock, not curiosity, but annoyance, like discovering an error that needed correcting. And now, with his whisper to Caroline, he had set that correction in motion. Caroline's professional smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Elijah saw it. She was calculating. Richard Langston, the long-standing client who had flown Skylux dozens of times, who probably tipped generously, who expected to be treated like royalty. And Elijah Cross, the reserved but immensely wealthy newcomer who had chartered this jet for a critical business trip. 2 clients, 1 seat. Elijah kept his expression neutral, eyes fixed on the tablet in his lap. But inside, a familiar storm churned. He had heard variations of that sentence his entire life. I don't feel comfortable, sometimes spoken, often implied. It was the quiet assumption that he was out of place, that he did not belong at the head of the table, the front of the line, or in seat 1A. His heart ticked faster, but his face betrayed nothing. This was the discipline. This was the armor. To show anger was to confirm their prejudice. To show pain was to feed their superiority. Calmness was his weapon. Silence, his shield. Still, his mind moved. Rapid, cold, analytical. He thought of Geneva. He thought of the deal. He thought of the headlines that would follow if a scene erupted here, on this jet, over a seat. He thought of his employees, thousands of them, who depended on his judgment not just in moments of triumph, but in moments of insult. For a brief moment, a question echoed in his mind. Should I fight now? Should I demand my right to remain where I am? Or should I yield, for now, and fight on a field of my choosing? He glanced, just once, at Caroline. She had straightened her shoulders, plastered the professional smile back on her face, and began to walk toward him. The decision had been made. The drama was about to begin. The cabin's soft hum continued. Outside, the engines idled, waiting for clearance. But inside, something invisible had shifted. A line had been drawn, one Elijah recognized all too well. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity. It was about power. And it was about to test how far Elijah Cross was willing to go to defend both. Elijah Cross had always chosen seat 1A for a reason. To most people, it was a symbol, the forwardmost chair in the cabin, a throne of sorts that carried unspoken status. But to Elijah, it was not about being seen as important. It was about being left alone. And the seat offered privacy, distance from the bustle of the cabin, and enough space for him to create a bubble of calm in the chaos of constant travel. He had built his life around discipline. At 43, Elijah had already lived several lives. The son of a postal worker and a school teacher in Baltimore. He grew up in a neighborhood where dreams rarely reached as high as the clouds he now traveled above. But Elijah was different. He carried an early fascination with patterns, with systems, with the way the smallest decision could ripple outward into enormous consequences. As a boy, he would sit on the front stoop of his row house, notebook in hand, sketching traffic flows, charting grocery store prices, mapping out the choices people made every day. That curiosity became his compass. He studied mathematics at Howard University, then earned an MBA at Stanford, one of the few black men in his class. The boardrooms he entered after graduation were not built for him. He learned that quickly. There were polite smiles, offhand jokes, subtle doubts about whether he belonged. But Elijah did not fight those moments with noise. He fought them with excellence. Each insult became fuel. Each slight became a lesson in patience. When he founded NovaSphere Analytics at 32, he was already battle-tested. The company started in a cramped shared office with 2 engineers and a vision to harness predictive algorithms not for ad clicks or retail gimmicks, but for solving the hardest logistical problems in industry and medicine. A decade later, NovaSphere had revolutionized supply chain forecasting, disease outbreak modeling, and urban planning simulations. Governments consulted him. Corporations depended on his data. Investors praised him as a visionary. Yet despite his billions, despite the awards, despite the magazine covers, Elijah Cross never shed the sense that the world still tested him differently. He had to prove himself every day, in every room, in every glance exchanged with men like Richard Langston. That was why he liked seat 1A. Alone in the front row, he could set aside the endless calculations of image and perception. He could simply exist, undisturbed, focused, calm. This morning he had boarded the jet early. The Westport Executive Airfield was brisk and quiet, the air sharp with the scent of jet fuel and fresh coffee. He carried only a leather bag with a change of clothes and his tablet. Simplicity was his shield against distraction. He shook the hand of the concierge, exchanged polite greetings with Caroline Meyer at the cabin door, and slid into Seat 1A with a faint sense of relief. For 20 minutes he had peace. He reviewed key points of the Geneva meeting. He traced scenarios in his mind, considering how the Swiss robotics executives might resist and how he would guide them toward agreement. He thought of the product lines NovaSphere could create by merging predictive analytics with robotics. He thought of his employees, of the excitement they would feel when news of the acquisition broke. Then Richard Langston arrived. Langston's presence filled the cabin like cheap cologne. Loud apologies for being late. Jokes tossed at Caroline as if she were an old friend. A dismissive hand wave as he surrendered his carry-on bag. Elijah knew the type. Men who built mid-sized fortunes through leveraged buyouts, who preyed on distressed companies like vultures circling a carcass. Men who wore arrogance as casually as a golf shirt. Elijah had recognized him immediately. Langston's face had appeared in finance magazines, always smiling too broadly, always standing in front of some acquisition deal touted as brilliant. Though Elijah knew the truth, Langston specialized in gutting companies, firing workers, and extracting value until nothing remained. A predator dressed in wealth. When Langston saw Elijah in seat 10, his expression flickered. It was brief, but Elijah caught it. Annoyance, as if the world had played a trick on him by letting a black man occupy the throne. That flicker turned into the whisper that poisoned the cabin. Elijah's reaction was automatic. Years of practice hardened his face into calm neutrality. But inside, the storm began. He thought of his father, who once told him, "You don't have to answer every insult with your fists. Sometimes the best answer is patience. But don't ever confuse patience with weakness." He thought of his mother, who drilled into him that excellence was not just a goal. It was a shield, the only thing that could make the world stop doubting him. And he thought of himself, sitting in countless first-class cabins where people assumed he had taken a wrong turn. Seat 1A had never been a symbol to Elijah, until now. He shifted slightly, adjusting the tablet in his hands, but his eyes did not lift. Caroline's shoes tapped softly on the carpet as she approached. Elijah could feel her hesitation even before she spoke. He had seen that expression before, the look of someone torn between what was right and what was convenient. Langston's voice floated again from behind, louder this time. dripping with false cheer. "Caroline, you know I always sit there. Tell him to move. It's just easier for everyone. Everyone." Elijah let the word echo in his mind. Everyone, except him. He closed his eyes briefly. A breath. He let the anger rise and then pressed it back down, compressing it into something sharper. Anger, shown here, would be a victory for Langston. Silence, composure, would be a blade. But he also knew the test was not just about endurance. It was about choosing the battlefield. His tablet screen dimmed as it idled. He tapped it awake again, but his eyes remained fixed inward. He weighed his choices. If he refused outright, the confrontation would escalate. Caroline might call the captain. Langston would raise his voice. And what then? A public humiliation at the airport. Headlines about an unruly passenger, his Geneva deal overshadowed by gossip. Or he could move. Yield for now. Let them mistake silence for surrender. And then, later, when the time was right, strike in a way that would leave no doubt who truly held power. That inner calculation played out in seconds. Caroline reached his side, her hands clasped in practiced politeness. "Mr. Cross," she began, her voice just slightly too sweet. "I'm so sorry, but Mr. Langston is very particular about this seat. He finds it helps him relax during flights. Would you mind terribly if we relocated you to 4A? It's identical, just a bit further back." Elijah looked at her, finally meeting her eyes. Calm, steady, unblinking. He said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Caroline shifted her weight. His lips parted, and his voice came low, smooth, deliberate. "I requested this seat. I paid for this seat. I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Caroline's smile tightened. She glanced back at Langston, who was pretending to read a magazine. His lips curled in a smirk. The air in the cabin thickened. The hum of the engine seemed louder. Elijah felt his pulse steady. The battle had begun, though the war was far from decided. What struck him most, as he looked at Caroline and heard Langston's shallow breathing behind her, was not surprise. It was inevitability. He had always known a moment like this would come again. The only question was how he would respond when it did. And in that quiet, in the rarefied air of Seat 1A, Elijah Cross decided. The air shifted when Richard Langston entered the cabin, as if the space itself recoiled from his presence. Elijah felt it even before the man spoke. The late arrival, the hurried footsteps on the air stairs, the booming voice apologizing to no one in particular, all of it carried the weight of entitlement. Richard Langston did not simply walk onto planes. He conquered them. Traffic was a nightmare. Langston announced loudly as if the cabin itself had been waiting breathlessly for his arrival. His tone was half complaint, half boast, the kind of voice that expected laughter at the end of every sentence. Caroline Meyer smiled too quickly, taking his bag with a deferential nod. She had greeted Elijah politely when he boarded, but with Langston, her manner carried something else: familiarity, perhaps even a hint of admiration. Langston stood in the aisle for a moment, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Elijah in Seat 1A, and for the briefest second his expression faltered. It was not shock. It was not confusion. It was irritation, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. The look of a man confronted with something he had already decided should not be. Elijah watched this unfold from behind the stillness of his composure. His tablet rested on his lap, but his attention had shifted fully to the new arrival. Langston was exactly the type of man Elijah had built his armor for. Wealthy, yes, but also careless. A man whose fortune came from tearing things down rather than building them up. A predator who smiled for magazine covers while families lost jobs in the shadows of his deals. Langston finally moved forward, closer to Caroline, lowering his voice but not enough to escape Elijah's ears. "Honestly, Caroline," he said, his tone dripping with conspiratorial disdain, "I don't feel comfortable with him sitting up front." The words fell heavy in the cabin. They did not need clarification. Their meaning was sharp, unmistakable. Elijah's grip on his tablet tightened, though his face remained calm. He had heard such words before, in different variations, in different places, sometimes spoken openly, sometimes implied through glances, through hesitations, through questions that asked without asking. "Are you supposed to be here?" He had learned to live with those moments, to transform them into fuel, but each one left a mark, a scar that could be pressed and reopened. Langston had pressed it deliberately, casually, as if it cost him nothing. Caroline's smile faltered. For a brief moment her eyes darted between the two men. Her posture stiffened, then softened again as she plastered professionalism across her face. Elijah could see the calculation forming in her mind. Langston was a long-time client. He had flown Skylux for years, bringing revenue and prestige. Elijah, though wealthy and powerful in his own right, was newer, less familiar. The decision for Caroline was not about right or wrong. It was about loyalty, habit, convenience. Elijah knew before she took her first step what her choice would be. Her heels clicked softly as she approached. Elijah did not look up. He kept his eyes on his tablet, though the numbers and documents on the screen had blurred into meaninglessness. He was listening to her footsteps, to the subtle tremor in her breath as she prepared to speak. "Mr. Cross," Caroline began with that bright customer service tone. "I am so sorry to trouble you. Mr. Langston has a preference for this seat. It helps him with his flight anxiety. Would you mind terribly if we moved you to another seat? It is identical, just a few rows back." The lie was thin. Elijah could hear it in the quickness of her delivery, in the way her eyes flicked briefly toward Langston and then back to him. Anxiety was not the issue. Preference was not the issue. The issue was him. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze with calm intensity. "I requested this seat. I paid for this seat. I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Caroline hesitated. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. She glanced toward Langston again. He was pretending to leaf through a magazine, but his smirk betrayed his satisfaction. He believed the outcome was inevitable. Langston broke the silence himself. "Look, pal, it's not a big deal. Just move. It'll make things easier." The word struck Elijah like a spark on dry tinder. Pal. It was dismissive, infantilizing, designed to strip dignity with a single syllable. His anger surged, hot and immediate, but he caught it, compressed it, reshaped it into cold resolve. He would not give Langston the satisfaction of a reaction. "My name is Mr. Cross," Elijah said evenly, his voice dropping with authority, "and I will not be moving." Caroline blinked, her mask of composure slipping for a moment. She had expected compliance. Most passengers yielded when a request was framed as a favor to the crew. Elijah's refusal created a tension she did not know how to resolve. "Sir," she said, her voice edging toward firmness, "we want everyone to be comfortable. Mr. Langston is one of our valued clients, and he has a preference. We would greatly appreciate your cooperation." Elijah held her gaze. And is my comfort less valuable than his? I was told this would be a private flight. Adding another passenger without my knowledge already breached that agreement. Asking me to move from the seat I reserved compounds the issue. You are asking me to accept less than what I paid for because he is uncomfortable with my presence. That is not acceptable. Caroline flushed. Her professionalism was unraveling. She fell back on the authority she still believed she had. I'll need to speak with the captain, she said sharply, turning on her heel toward the cockpit. Elijah leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He could feel the storm tightening around him. Langston's smirk widened. The game, in his mind, was already won. Moments later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Gerald Stone emerged. A tall man with silver hair and a weathered face. He carried the aura of command. His presence was supposed to bring resolution. Instead, Elijah recognized something else in the captain's eyes. Impatience, bias, the desire for the path of least resistance. Mr. Cross, Captain Stone began in a low voice. Caroline tells me we have a seating issue. Mr. Langston usually sits here. It would help us depart on time if you would move. Elijah looked up calmly. There is no issue. I am sitting in the seat I paid for. That is the extent of it. The captain's tone hardened. Son, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. We have a schedule to keep. Just move to the other seat so we can take off. The word hit Elijah like another blow. Son. It carried centuries of weight, condescension disguised as paternal authority. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Captain, with all due respect, this is not about schedules. This is about honoring an agreement. I requested this seat. I paid for this seat. Are you telling me you will not honor that Captain Stone crossed his arms? I am telling you that as captain of this plane, I have the authority to arrange seating as necessary for the comfort of my passengers. Mr. Langston is not comfortable. That makes this a safety concern. You can either comply, or we will have to remove you from the flight. The ultimatum hung in the air. Langston leaned back, clearly savoring the moment. Caroline stood stiffly behind the captain, her eyes glinting with a hint of triumph. Elijah felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He could fight now. He could force a scene, raise his voice, refuse to move. But to what end? To be dragged from the plane, to risk his company's deal in Geneva, to feed the very narrative Langston wanted to create inside. His fury roared, but outwardly, he remained composed. He understood what was happening. They thought they were humiliating him. They thought they were winning. They had no idea what they were truly igniting. He looked at the captain for a long moment, then closed his tablet and stood, graceful, deliberate, measured. He picked up his bag and walked down the aisle, past Langston's smirk, past Caroline's satisfied nod, to Site 4A. As he sat down, the shame was a weight in his chest, but beneath it, something colder formed, a plan, a resolve sharpened by humiliation. They thought they had forced him to yield. They were wrong. The game was not over. It had just begun. Caroline Meyer stood near the galley, her back straight, her hands pressed together to hide the faint trembling of her fingers. The cabin had returned to its quiet hum, but the air felt heavier now, thick with the residue of confrontation. Elijah Cross sat in 4A, his posture calm, his eyes on his tablet. But Caroline could feel the weight of his presence even from across the aisle. Richard Langston stretched comfortably in seat 1A, sipping champagne with a self-satisfied grin. He leaned toward her at one point, raising his glass slightly, as though she had just performed a service worthy of reward. She smiled back, though it was strained. She told herself she had made the right choice. Langston had been a Skylux aviation client for over a decade. He tipped well. He praised crew members by name in feedback reports. He even sent Christmas baskets to the staff once. He was the kind of passenger who built loyalty not just through money, but through familiarity. Caroline knew his quirks, his drink preferences, the way he liked his seat reclined before takeoff. To her, Richard Langston was predictable, comfortable, safe. Elijah Cross was not safe. She knew who he was, of course. Any crew member who worked executive charters studied the passenger manifests carefully. She knew he was the founder of NovaSphere Analytics, that his net worth dwarfed Langston's, that his presence on this flight was tied to a massive business deal in Switzerland. She had read the briefing. She had seen his photo, but she did not know him. And in Caroline's world, familiarity was currency. She replayed the moment in her head, the instant when Langston leaned close to her with that whisper, "I don't feel comfortable with him sitting up front." His voice had been casual, but she had known what he meant. Everyone knew what he meant. It wasn't the seat. It wasn't anxiety. It was the fact that a black man was sitting in the position Langston believed belonged to him. Caroline had hesitated. For a second, she thought about honoring Elijah's booking. It was his charter, after all. His money had secured the entire jet. But then she thought of Langston's long history, of his reputation for generosity toward staff, of the subtle hierarchy that existed in the luxury travel world. In her mind, the equation formed quickly. Protect the old client. Manage the new one. Smooth it over later with an apology and a complimentary bottle of wine. She chose Langston. The choice still sat heavily with her. She sipped from her water bottle, hoping to quiet the knot in her stomach. She told herself she had done her job, that her duty was to de-escalate. But was it de-escalation or was it surrender? Elijah had looked at her with eyes that seemed to pierce through every layer of professionalism she could summon. Calm, steady, unblinking. His words had been precise, polite, but they carried a weight that unsettled her. "I requested this seat. I paid for this seat. I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The way he said it had lodged itself in her mind. It was not just a refusal. It was a statement of identity. And yet she had turned to the captain. Now Captain Gerald Stone sat in the cockpit with his co-pilot, Mark Harris, both men silent as they finished their pre-flight checklist. Caroline had served with Stone for years. He was a veteran, authoritative, respected, but she had seen his temper flare with clients before, always softened later by apologies from the operations team. He valued order more than fairness. She knew the moment she asked him to intervene that he would side with Langston. It was the path of least resistance. She glanced again at Elijah. His face was calm, but there was something unsettling in that calm. He wasn't sulking, wasn't brooding. He was working. His fingers tapped steadily on the tablet, his eyes sharp and focused. Caroline wondered what he was writing. An email to a colleague. A complaint to Skylux management. A lawsuit. The thought made her uneasy. Langston, on the other hand, had relaxed fully into seat 1A, his legs stretched out, his glass refilled. He laughed loudly at his own jokes, occasionally glancing back at Elijah with an air of triumph. Caroline had seen this dynamic before. One passenger dominates, another yields. The crew chooses sides. It was not uncommon, but this time it felt different. She tried to reassure herself. This would pass. By the time they reached Geneva, Langston would be satisfied. Elijah would have cooled down, and she would smooth it over with practiced charm. That was her job. She had built a career on knowing how to appease powerful men. She had mastered the art of being agreeable, of redirecting anger into politeness. She told herself she could do it again. But then a question slipped unbidden into her mind. What if I chose wrong? The thought unsettled her. She shook it away. Busying herself with cabin preparations, she adjusted headrests, checked the galley, reviewed the service plan. But no matter how she tried to focus, her mind returned to Elijah's eyes. Steady, calm, cold. The eyes of a man who had not accepted defeat, only delayed response. Meanwhile, Elijah was deep inside his own thoughts, outwardly composed, inwardly calculating. He had yielded the seat, but he had not surrendered. The humiliation pressed against him like a weight, but beneath it something else was forming a clarity, a resolve. He thought of his company, of the power he commanded, of the influence he wielded. He thought of Skylux Aviation itself, of the months of quiet negotiations NovaSphere had conducted through a shell corporation. The acquisition papers were nearly finalized. A decision that had been weeks away now suddenly crystallized. The events of this flight had turned it personal. Elijah glanced up briefly, catching Caroline's eye across the cabin. She looked away quickly, focusing on her service tray. But the image lingered. He saw her hesitation, her guilt, the thin veneer of professionalism stretched too tight. He knew she was not the root of the problem. She was a symptom. The disease was deeper, embedded in the culture of deference to wealth and privilege, blind to dignity and fairness. Langston laughed again, the sound grating against the quiet cabin. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his father's words, patience versus weakness. He thought of every time he had been told to wait, to be calm, to let things pass. And he thought of the opportunity now before him, the chance not just to respond, but to reshape the very system that allowed this insult to occur. Caroline busied herself with Langston's second glass of champagne. She told herself she had done her job, that she had ensured a smooth departure. Yet as she poured, her hand trembled slightly, and a drop of the golden liquid splashed onto the polished wood. Langston didn't notice. Elijah did. The engines roared to life as the jet prepared for takeoff. The cabin vibrated, a physical reminder of motion, of inevitability. Caroline secured the galley, took her jump seat, and buckled in. She exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension from her shoulders. Across the cabin, Elijah set his tablet aside, his face serene but unreadable. Caroline closed her eyes briefly as the jet surged down the runway. She told herself she had made the right choice, but somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered otherwise. The jet leveled at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign switched off, and the cabin settled into a hush. But beneath that hush lay a storm waiting to break. Elijah Cross sat in 4A, posture straight, tablet in hand, though his eyes barely scanned the screen. He was listening. Every clink of glass in the galley, every laugh that burst too loudly from Richard Langston's mouth, every hushed step of Caroline Meyer as she hovered nervously between the two men. He knew the battle wasn't over. The confrontation had merely shifted form. It had gone from whispered prejudice to official authority, from Caroline's thin request to Captain Gerald Stone's command. Elijah had yielded the seat. He had allowed them to believe they had won. But inside, he carried the cold burn of injustice. Every detail was etched in his mind. Caroline's faltering smile, Langston's smirk. The captain's use of the word son. None of it would be forgotten. None of it would go unanswered. Still, the cabin had not fully released him. He could feel Caroline's eyes flick toward him from time to time, a darting glance quickly withdrawn. He could feel Langston's gloating presence pressing from the front of the plane, and he could feel the echo of the captain's authority like a weight in the air, reminding him that his refusal had been stamped out by force, not by reason. Caroline approached with cautious steps. "Mr. Cross," she said softly, "can I bring you something to drink? Perhaps wine or champagne?" Elijah looked at her, his face calm but unreadable. "Water will be fine." She nodded quickly, retreating toward the galley. He knew the offer wasn't about service. It was about distraction, about trying to smooth over the jagged edges of what had already occurred. But Elijah did not want smoothing. He wanted clarity. Langston called out suddenly, loud enough to fill the cabin. "Caroline, this champagne is excellent. You really do know how to take care of your passengers." His eyes flicked toward Elijah with mocking triumph. "Some people just don't appreciate how this works." Caroline forced a laugh. The sound brittle. Elijah said nothing. His silence was not surrender. It was preparation. Moments later, Captain Stone emerged from the cockpit. He walked with the deliberate stride of authority, his jaw set, his uniform crisp. He paused near Elijah's row, his arms crossed over his chest. "Mr. Cross," he began, his tone heavy with command. "I want to be sure we have no further issues during this flight." Elijah looked up slowly, meeting the captain's eyes. "There is no issue." "Captain, I am sitting in my assigned seat. I am working quietly. If there is an issue, it is not with me." The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let's be clear. I have the authority to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. That includes seating arrangements. You caused unnecessary disruption before takeoff, and I expect full cooperation moving forward. Do we understand each other?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying the man. He heard the edge in his voice, the underlying implication that compliance meant silence, and silence meant obedience, the kind of authority that expected deference, not respect. "You told me I was a disruption," Elijah said evenly. "I was sitting where I had been placed, without complaint. The disruption came from a whisper that carried prejudice, and you chose to enforce that prejudice. Tell me, Captain, is that what you call comfort and safety?" The captain's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward Caroline as if seeking backup, then back to Elijah. "This conversation is finished. You will remain in your seat, you will follow instructions, and you will not create further difficulties." Elijah held his gaze, unflinching. "I have followed every instruction given. But know this, Captain, the ease of your authority ends where dignity begins. You may control this aircraft, but you do not control me." For a moment, silence reigned. Even Langston's smirk seemed to fade as the weight of Elijah's words filled the cabin. Caroline shifted uneasily, her hands twisting together. The captain broke the silence with a dismissive shake of his head. "Stay in your seat, Mr. Cross. Do not test me further." He turned sharply and strode back toward the cockpit, his shoulders rigid. Langston chuckled softly, shaking his head as if amused by a child's stubbornness. "Some people just don't understand how to play the game," he muttered, not bothering to hide his voice. Elijah exhaled slowly, pressing his tablet awake again. His hands moved swiftly now, not on idle notes but on decisions. He was not venting. He was not sulking. He was calculating. Every word, every gesture from Caroline, from Langston, from Captain Stone, all of it became data. and Elijah Cross was a master of data. Carolyn approached again with a glass of water, her face carefully neutral. She set it gently on his side table. "If you need anything else, please let me know," she said, her voice tight. Elijah nodded once. He could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. He wondered if she sensed it, the shift that had taken place, the change in the balance of power. Perhaps she did. Perhaps not yet. The hours stretched on. Langston spoke loudly into his phone, laughing, boasting about his upcoming meetings in Europe. Caroline fussed over him, her movements sharp with forced cheer. Elijah remained silent, his tablet a shield, his thoughts a blade. Inside, he felt the weight of humiliation. Yes, but also the spark of something stronger. They had mistaken his composure for weakness. They had mistaken his silence for defeat. They had mistaken his patience for surrender. They were wrong. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He pictured the Geneva skyline, the boardroom awaiting him, the handshake that would finalize NovaSphere's acquisition of the robotics firm. He pictured the press release already drafted, the headlines that would declare the deal a triumph. And then he pictured something else, the contract waiting in a secure file, the one tied not to robotics, but to Skylux Aviation itself. The decision had been weeks away. Now it was closer, much closer. He opened his eyes, calm and steady. Caroline passed by again, glancing at him quickly before lowering her gaze. Langston stretched luxuriously in seat 1A, smug in his stolen throne. Captain Stone's voice drifted faintly from the cockpit, firm and authoritative as he spoke to the co-pilot. Elijah absorbed it all. He had yielded for now. But this was not the end. This was only the beginning of something none of them could yet imagine. The jet glided smoothly through the sky, its engines a steady roar muffled by insulation designed for luxury. The cabin was calm to the untrained eye. Champagne flutes clinked. A magazine rustled. The faint scent of citrus-scented wipes hung in the air. But beneath that surface calm, a storm raged in Elijah Cross's chest. He sat in 4A, outwardly serene. His posture remained dignified, his hands steady on his tablet. To anyone watching, he looked like a man working through spreadsheets, reviewing presentations, or sending emails. But his focus was not on Geneva anymore. It was on the weight pressing against him, the humiliating theater that had played out minutes earlier. The indignity sat heavy, like a stone pressing against his ribs. He replayed it in his mind, each detail cutting sharper with every turn. Langston's whisper, Caroline's faltering smile, the captain's word son, dripping with authority and dismissal. The smug triumph on Langston's face when Elijah finally rose from seat 1A. It was not the first time Elijah had endured such moments. His life had been dotted with them. Small but searing reminders that success did not grant immunity from prejudice. He had felt it in luxury stores when clerks watched him closely, assuming he was there to browse, not buy. He had felt it in boardrooms when his ideas were attributed to someone else, his voice overlooked until echoed by another. He had felt it in country clubs, in hotels, even in airports, where his suit and briefcase did little to erase the suspicion that he did not belong. But this felt different. This was not a passing glance or a muttered comment. This was open humiliation, reinforced by authority, staged in the theater of a luxury cabin where every detail was supposed to scream exclusivity and respect. They had stripped him of both in a single motion, dismissing his presence as trivial, his dignity as expendable. The rational part of his mind whispered its usual counsel: patience, restraint. Do not let anger dictate the response. Focus on the deal. But another voice rose louder, clearer. Enough. Elijah tapped his stylus against the tablet, pulling up encrypted files. His CFO, David Chen, had already prepared acquisition documents for Skylux Aviation. The deal had been on his radar for months. Skylux was overextended, burdened by debt, reliant on a handful of wealthy clients to keep afloat. It was a company vulnerable to the kind of quiet takeover NovaSphere specialized in through its holding entities. Elijah had not intended to sign until after the robotics deal, but now the decision felt inevitable. He drafted a secure message to David. The words were simple. Circumstances have changed. Send the final version. I want to close today. The reply came almost instantly. David was always fast, but this time Elijah could feel the urgency in the response. Understood. Uploading now. As the file appeared on his screen, Elijah's hand hovered over the stylus. A simple signature, a stroke of digital ink, and Skylux Aviation would no longer belong to the nameless executives who had allowed this culture to thrive. It would belong to him. He hesitated, not from doubt but from clarity. He wanted the weight of this choice to settle fully. This was no longer business. This was personal. This was not about a seat on a plane. This was about power, about dignity, about drawing a line where others thought none could exist. He signed. The confirmation came seconds later. Funds wired. Ownership transferred. Elijah Cross, the man who had been told to move from seat 1A, now owned the very company whose crew had humiliated him. The irony was sharp, almost intoxicating. He felt no joy. Not yet. This was not triumph. This was loading a weapon. The victory would come later, in the consequences. Caroline returned to the cabin, glancing briefly at Elijah as she moved to refill Langston's glass. She carried herself with forced ease, but Elijah noticed the tremor in her hands, the slight tightness around her smile. Perhaps she sensed it, the shift in the air, the invisible rearrangement of power, or perhaps she was only nervous about the memory of his refusal. Langston leaned back, champagne in hand, savoring his seat like a king on a throne. He raised his glass toward Elijah in a mocking toast. "To new beginnings," he said with a smirk. Elijah looked at him once, then returned his gaze to the tablet. Langston believed he had won. He believed the humiliation was final. But Elijah knew better. The game was not over. It had just begun. For the next hour, he worked steadily, not on Geneva, but on Skylux. He reviewed crew files as David sent them over. Caroline Meyer, lead flight attendant, long history with high-profile clients. Captain Gerald Stone, decorated veteran, respected but known for a hard edge. Mark Harris, the younger co-pilot, ambitious but untested. Each file a portrait not of individuals, but of liabilities. He felt no satisfaction reading them, only purpose. Their failures had revealed themselves in minutes. Caroline, who chose convenience over principle. Stone, who wielded authority as a weapon to enforce prejudice. Harris, silent and complicit, saying nothing as dignity was stripped from a passenger. And Langston, the catalyst, who had assumed wealth gave him dominion over others. The humiliation that weighed on Elijah's chest began to transform. It was still heavy, but now it was sharpened. It was no longer pain. It was resolve. He drafted another message to David. Prepare a full operational review. Begin with this crew. Terminations will follow. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The engines hummed. Langston laughed again. Caroline walked briskly down the aisle, but Elijah's mind was elsewhere, already shaping the reckoning to come. The humiliation would not be forgotten. It would be answered. And when the wheels touched down in Geneva, the balance of power would already have shifted. The Gulf Stream cut across the night sky, its sleek fuselage glowing faintly against the moonlight. Inside the cabin, time stretched long and heavy. Richard Langston had fallen into his usual pattern of brash storytelling, recounting past deals and embellishing them until even Caroline's polite nods began to feel strained. Every few minutes he erupted into laughter, loud enough to echo through the cabin. Elijah Cross listened to it all in silence. His tablet rested on the side table, glowing faintly in the dim light. Documents were open, messages streaming in from David Chen. But Elijah was no longer only working. He was watching. Every movement of Caroline's hands as she poured champagne, every glance exchanged between Captain Gerald Stone and his co-pilot Mark Harris when they stepped briefly into the cabin, every smirk from Langston as he cast triumphant looks toward seat 4A. Elijah had already acted. The papers were signed, the transfer confirmed. He owned Skylux Aviation. Yet ownership was not just a document. It was power that had to be revealed, measured, and finally wielded. And tonight, high above the Atlantic, he would begin that process. The first sign came quietly. Caroline passed by his seat, her hands clasped together in that overly professional way she adopted when she was uncertain. Elijah raised his eyes from the tablet and spoke calmly. "Ms. Meyer," he said. She paused, her face tightening as though bracing herself. "Yes, Mr. Cross, can I bring you something?" Elijah's voice was smooth, even almost conversational. "Do you know how long Skylux Aviation has been operating?" Caroline blinked. The question caught her off guard. "Nearly 30 years, I believe," she answered carefully. "And in those 30 years," Elijah continued, "how many times have you had to remove a passenger from a seat they paid for?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Well, occasionally we accommodate requests, but we try to make sure everyone is comfortable." Elijah studied her for a moment. Comfort is a dangerous currency. It can buy silence. It can excuse injustice. But eventually it leaves a debt that must be repaid. Caroline shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. She gave a quick nod and moved toward the galley, her steps a little quicker than before. Elijah leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He was not trying to frighten her. Not yet. But he wanted the seed planted. He wanted her to feel the shift, the sense that the ground beneath her was not as solid as it seemed. In the cockpit, Captain Stone glanced over his shoulder toward the cabin. He had heard fragments of Elijah's voice. He muttered something to Mark Harris, who nodded nervously. "Young man looks calm," Stone said. His tone edged with suspicion. Too calm, like he's waiting for something. Harris hesitated. Maybe he's just trying to put it behind him. Big clients usually do. Stone grunted. Maybe. Or maybe he's the type to remember. Back in the cabin, Langston drained another glass and called out, "Caroline, darling, another bottle. Would you? We're celebrating tonight." Celebrating what Elijah asked quietly, not looking up from his tablet. Langston smirked. Celebrating victory. Of course. The victory of seat 1A. He chuckled at his own joke, his voice booming across the cabin. Elijah finally raised his eyes. He studied Langston for a long moment, his face calm, unreadable. "Do you know the difference between victory and illusion, Mr. Langston?" Langston's smirk faltered. Enlighten me. Elijah's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. Victory endures. Illusion collapses when the truth arrives. For the first time that night, Langston seemed unsettled. He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively, but his laughter came forced. Caroline poured another drink, her hands trembling just slightly. Elijah returned to his tablet. A new message blinked across the screen from David Chen. The press release was ready at 9 m. Eastern Time. The world would know NovaSphere's acquisition of Skylux Aviation. By then, the crew who stood in this cabin would no longer be employees of the company they thought they served. They would belong to him. He tapped out a response. Schedule it. No delays. A strange stillness settled over him. The humiliation he had endured earlier no longer felt raw. It felt like fuel, already consumed and transformed into energy for what was to come. He was no longer reacting. He was shaping. Caroline returned from the galley, pausing briefly near his seat. She wanted to speak. Elijah could see it in her eyes, but no words came. Instead, she adjusted the tray table, smoothed the already perfect linen, and walked on. Elijah watched her go, then closed the tablet. The weight in his chest had not disappeared, but it had changed. Humiliation had been replaced by inevitability. For Richard Langston, Caroline Meyer, Gerald Stone, and Mark Harris, the night still felt ordinary, a mere inconvenience soon to be forgotten. For Elijah, it was the turning point of an empire. He reached for the glass of water Caroline had set beside him earlier. Lifting it slowly, he whispered to himself words only he could hear, to new beginnings. The glass touched his lips, cool and clear, and in that moment, Elijah Cross was no longer the man who had been forced from C-1A. He was the man who had just begun to unravel an entire system, thread by thread, until the illusion of their victory dissolved in the bright light of truth. Dawn broke quietly over the Atlantic, a thin line of gold brushing against the endless blue. The Gulfstream's cabin was hushed in that suspended way only long flights can create, where time slows and even small sounds carry weight. Caroline Meyer adjusted a service tray in the galley, glancing back toward the passengers. Richard Langston had dozed off, his head tilted against the leather seat, a half-empty flute of champagne precariously balanced on the side table. Elijah Cross sat upright in 4A, awake, composed, his tablet glowing softly against his face. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast when the news broke, thousands of miles below, in glass towers and trading floors, on news feeds and corporate dashboards. The headline flashed, NovaSphere Analytics acquires Skylux Aviation in landmark deal. The press release was precise, polished, and impossible to ignore. It named Elijah Cross as the new chairman of the private aviation company, outlined sweeping operational reforms, and declared an immediate zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Phones buzzed. Investors called. Competitors whispered. Within minutes, aviation insiders were already talking. Skylux, the company that had ferried power brokers and celebrities for decades, now had a new owner. And not just any owner. Elijah Cross. But inside the Gulfstream, the crew still carried on as though nothing had changed. Caroline was refilling water bottles. Stone and Harris were locked in routine checks in the cockpit, and Langston shifted in his seat, muttering in his sleep. None of them knew that in the space of a single headline, their world had been rewritten. Elijah did not announce it, not yet. He let the silence hold, savoring the irony. They treated him as an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. Soon they would discover that the man they dismissed was now the one who held their careers in his hand. His tablet buzzed with a secure message from David Chen. The press release is live. Industry response already strong. Congratulations. Elijah typed a brief reply. Thank you. Proceed with the operational audit. Begin with this crew. He set the tablet aside and folded his hands, breathing deeply. This was not triumphalism. It was purpose. He had been humiliated. Yes, but humiliation without transformation was just pain. He would turn it into something greater, something that reached beyond his own dignity and into the culture of the company he now commanded. Caroline returned from the galley, pausing near his row. She hesitated, as though wanting to speak, but chose instead to adjust the already neat safety card in the pocket by his knee. Elijah watched her carefully. He could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes, the quiet unease. She wanted to ask if he was still angry. She wanted reassurance, but Elijah gave her none. He simply inclined his head once, a gesture that was polite but distant. She walked on, her footsteps a little too quick. In the cockpit. Captain Stone rubbed his temples. Feels like this flight is dragging, he muttered. Mark Harris gave a small laugh. Long night flights always do. Stone frowned. No, it's not that. It's the cabin. Tense. Like something's building. Harris shrugged. Langston's a handful. Cross seems quiet enough. Maybe we're reading too much into it. But even Harris's voice lacked conviction. He had seen Elijah's eyes when he refused to move earlier. They were not the eyes of a man defeated. They were the eyes of a man waiting. 2 hours later, when Langston stirred awake, his first instinct was to check his phone. He tapped it awake, scrolling lazily, until the headline caught his eye. He froze. NovaSphere Analytics acquires Skylux Aviation. The words landed with a weight he could not immediately process. He read them again, slower this time. Then he read the subheading. Elijah Cross, CEO of NovaSphere, assumes direct oversight of operational standards effective immediately. His stomach turned cold. He looked across the cabin at Elijah, who sat calmly with his hands folded, eyes closed as if meditating. For the first time, Langston's smirk vanished. He cleared his throat, louder than necessary. Caroline, he called, his voice sharper than before. She hurried over. Yes, Mr. Langston. Did you see this? He thrust his phone toward her. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening as the headline registered. She read it twice, her hand tightening around the device. That cannot be right, she whispered. Elijah opened his eyes. His voice was quiet but carried across the cabin with unshakable certainty. It is right. Caroline turned toward him slowly, her mouth parting but no words forming. Langston stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. What is this, Langston demanded. Some kind of stunt? Some trick? Elijah met his gaze evenly. It is ownership, as of this morning. Skylux Aviation is a subsidiary of NovaSphere, which means it is mine. Caroline swayed slightly, as though the floor had shifted beneath her. She looked down at the phone again, the press release glowing in bold type. The words were undeniable. Elijah Cross was her employer now. Langston barked out a laugh, but it was hollow. You expect me to believe you bought the company in the middle of a flight? Elijah's lips curved faintly, not into a smile, but into something colder. I did not need to wait. The decision was overdue. Your actions, and the actions of this crew, only clarified the timing. Silence filled the cabin. Caroline's hands trembled at her sides. Langston gripped his phone tighter, his bravado faltering. From the cockpit, Stone's voice cut through the intercom. "Cabin secure." Caroline's voice cracked as she answered, "Yes, Captain." But inside, she knew nothing was secure anymore. Elijah leaned back in his seat, eyes calm, voice steady. "This flight is more than a journey to Geneva. It is a transition. By the time we land, Skylux will no longer be what it was, and neither will any of you." The word settled like a stone in water, rippling outward. Caroline's throat went dry. Langston looked away, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. Even Mark Harris, peering briefly from the cockpit door, caught a glimpse of the still figure in 4A and felt a chill run through him. The reckoning had begun. The jet sailed steady through the thinning clouds, bound for Geneva. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. A silence had fallen, thick and unyielding, broken only by the hum of engines. Richard Langston sat stiffly in seat 1A, his earlier arrogance now dimmed into unease. Caroline Meyer lingered in the galley, her posture rigid, as though bracing for impact. And in Seat 4A, Elijah Cross sat poised, serene, his hands folded loosely on his lap, his presence suddenly larger than the cabin itself. It was Caroline who broke first. She stepped carefully into the aisle, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Mr. Cross, this announcement, this acquisition, is it truly real?" Elijah's gaze lifted to her, calm, unwavering. "You've read the headline. You've seen the release. It is as real as the air we breathe in this cabin." Caroline swallowed, her throat tight. Then that means, it means," Elijah said, his tone even, "that you no longer serve Skylux Aviation as you once knew it. You serve me." The words landed like a verdict. Caroline's eyes widened, her breath caught. She wanted to protest, to insist that she had only followed protocol, that she had been trying to balance impossible demands. But the memory of her choice earlier in the flight cut through every excuse. She had chosen Langston's comfort over Elijah's dignity, and now the man she had dismissed as a problem to be managed was her employer. Langston shifted in his seat, forcing a laugh that sounded more brittle than confident. "This is absurd. Do you have any idea how companies work? Cross, you can't just waltz in midair and declare ownership. There are boards, regulators, contracts." Elijah cut him off with a glance, sharp enough to silence the words. "Do not lecture me about how companies work. Richard, I build them, I buy them, and when necessary, I dismantle them. Skylux belongs to NovaSphere now, which means the seats we occupy, the crew who serve, the very authority of this flight, it all rests in my hands." For the first time, Langston faltered. His bravado cracked under the weight of Elijah's certainty. He leaned back, gripping the armrest as though the leather could anchor him. Caroline's voice trembled as she tried again. "Mr. Cross, I never meant to disrespect you. I was only trying to keep peace in the cabin." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Peace built on prejudice is not peace. It is surrender. You thought compliance would quiet the storm, but all you did was feed it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She lowered her gaze, shame coloring her cheeks. The cockpit door opened then, and Captain Gerald Stone stepped into the aisle. He looked between Caroline, Langston, and Elijah, confusion lining his face. "What's going on here?" I heard raised voices. Caroline turned quickly toward him. "Captain, the news. NovaSphere acquired Skylux. It says Mr. Cross is—" "I know what it says." Stone interrupted. His tone clipped. He had seen the message, too. his phone buzzing with alerts from corporate dispatch. His jaw was set. His pride stiffened against the truth. He turned to Elijah. "Even if that's true, my authority on this aircraft is not in question. I am captain. I am in command until we land." Elijah's voice was measured, but it carried an undeniable weight. Authority, captain, is not a license to abuse. You used your command earlier to enforce a prejudice. You threatened me with removal, not for safety, but for convenience. You called my presence trivial. You called me son. Stone's jaw tightened. His authority had rarely been questioned, let alone by a passenger. "I acted to ensure order. That is my duty." Elijah's gaze sharpened. "Order without justice is tyranny. You confused compliance with safety. You confused arrogance with priority. And you revealed yourself unfit to command." The words hung heavy in the cabin. Mark Harris, peering nervously from the cockpit, felt his stomach twist. He had been silent through the confrontation earlier, content to let his captain take the lead. Now that silence felt like a brand on his conscience, Elijah's eyes moved to him. "And you, Mr. Harris, you watched. You said nothing. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. You failed not because you acted wrongly, but because you refused to act at all." Harris flushed, shame burning across his young face. He opened his mouth, but no excuse formed. He simply lowered his gaze, words choking in his throat. Caroline stood frozen, her hands clasped tight in front of her. Langston muttered under his breath, but even he did not rise to Elijah's stare. Elijah leaned back slightly, his voice lowering, calm but resonant. This flight was supposed to be a simple journey to Geneva. Instead, it became a test. And you failed. Each of you revealed what you truly value: comfort, convenience, authority, but not dignity, not justice. And now the truth has arrived, and it will not be denied. Silence followed. The hum of the engine seemed louder, the cabin narrower. The weight of Elijah's words pressed against them all. Langston finally broke the stillness, his voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "So what now? Cross, what's your grand plan? Fire us all mid-air, strip us of our wings while we're still above the ocean." Elijah's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. "I do not need to act mid-air. The verdict is already written. When we land in Geneva, you will meet it." Caroline's knees felt weak. She gripped the back of a seat to steady herself. She thought of the career she had built over 20 years, the loyalty she had shown, the sacrifices she had made. And she thought of the single choice she had made today, the choice that would now define it all. Captain Stone's fists clenched at his sides, his pride warring with the reality he could not ignore. He was used to being the final word in the sky, but today he had encountered a man whose authority was not limited by altitude. Elijah turned his gaze forward, serene once again, as though the confrontation had drained none of his energy. His voice was soft, almost meditative. "This is not about revenge. It is about accountability. And accountability, like gravity, cannot be escaped." The engines roared gently as the jet pressed on toward Switzerland. But for those in the cabin, the journey had already changed. They were no longer crew and passenger, no longer master and client. They were witnesses awaiting a reckoning in the sky. The chime rang through the cabin, soft but unmistakable, signaling the start of descent. Outside, the dawn light over Switzerland broke across the horizon, pale and golden, spilling onto the mountains below. The Gulf Stream banked gracefully, its engines humming with quiet power. But inside the cabin, no one felt steady. Caroline Meyer moved briskly through the aisle, collecting glasses and adjusting tray tables, though her hands betrayed her. They trembled as she lifted a half-empty flute from Langston's side table. She had spent thousands of hours in cabins just like this one, performing the rituals of professionalism until they felt second nature. But this morning, her steps were heavy, her breath uneven, her chest tight with dread. Every time she passed Elijah Cross in seat 4A, she felt his presence pressing against her, not through words but through silence. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded, yet his calm had become a verdict all its own. She thought of his words earlier. Peace built on prejudice is not peace. They echoed in her head with every step she took. Langston shifted in seat 1A, restless. His phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The arrogance that once animated his posture was gone, replaced by unease. He kept scrolling through the news article, rereading the press release as if repetition might make it false. NovaSphere acquires Skylux Aviation. Elijah Cross assumes direct oversight. It was undeniable. He had mocked the man, dismissed him, even celebrated his humiliation, only to discover that humiliation was the spark of his undoing. In the cockpit, Captain Gerald Stone's jaw was set like granite. He went through his descent checklist with sharp, precise motions, speaking clipped commands to Mark Harris. But beneath the surface, he was boiling. He had built his career on authority. Authority in the air was absolute. Yet today, he had seen it undermined. His words stripped of their weight. His pride told him it was wrong. His gut whispered something else, that he had lost the battle the moment he chose convenience over integrity. Mark Harris was quieter than usual. His responses to the captain's commands were crisp, but his voice carried strain. He thought of Elijah's words to him earlier. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. He had told himself at the time that he was just following protocol, respecting hierarchy. But deep down he knew Elijah was right. His silence had spoken louder than any defense. The aircraft descended steadily, the Swiss landscape opening wide beneath them. Geneva's lake shimmered silver, framed by the jagged lines of the Alps. But for those inside, the view was invisible, swallowed by the tension pressing against their chests. Caroline returned to her jump seat, strapping in as the landing gear extended with a deep mechanical groan. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a silent plea that somehow this would resolve without the catastrophe she feared. She thought of her career, of the countless hours spent catering to demanding passengers, of the sacrifices she had made for this job. Would it all end here? On a runway in Switzerland, Langston tried one last time to reclaim the voice he thought he had lost. He leaned toward Elijah, his tone strained but still laced with bravado. You think owning a company gives you power over people like me. You think a press release makes you a king. Elijah's eyes opened slowly, his gaze steady, almost gentle. Power does not make me a king. Richard, it reveals the truth of those who believe themselves untouchable. And truth, unlike illusion, does not fade. Langston's mouth snapped shut. He turned forward, staring at the seat back, his chest rising and falling too quickly. The wheels struck the runway with a solid thud, the engines roaring in reverse thrust. The Gulfstream slowed, rolling smoothly toward the private terminal. For the first time since takeoff, Caroline felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the moment where the abstract threat would become real. As the jet taxied, Elijah unbuckled his belt and rose. The move was startling, breaking every rule of protocol during landing. Caroline's eyes widened. "Sir, please, you must remain seated until Elijah raised a hand, calm and steady," and she fell silent. His presence filled the narrow aisle as he stepped forward. He stopped near the cockpit door and spoke, his voice low but carrying through the entire cabin. "Captain Stone, Mr. Harris, Ms. Meyer, and Richard Langston, hear me." The engines quieted as the jet slowed to its final taxi. The silence made his words sharper. "This morning, you chose. Each of you revealed what you value when dignity was placed in front of you. You chose comfort, pride, arrogance, and silence. You forgot that every seat in this aircraft belongs not to preference or prejudice, but to principle. You forgot that authority without justice is nothing but a mask." Caroline's heart pounded. Langston swallowed hard. Harris kept his eyes fixed on the controls, but his knuckles were white against the yoke. Stone clenched his jaw, his pride and his fear colliding inside him. Elijah continued, his voice steady as the wheels rolled beneath them. "You thought this was about a seat. It was not. It was about the measure of character. And when tested, you failed. Now comes the consequence. The jet turned into its assigned stand, the ground crew approaching." Caroline could hear the whir of the air stairs being wheeled into place. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Elijah turned toward her, his eyes holding hers until she felt exposed, stripped of every excuse. "Ms. Meyer, you made your choice when you valued prejudice over dignity. Your service ends here." Caroline's breath caught. The words landed heavier than any turbulence she had endured. She wanted to protest, to plead, but her throat closed tight. She felt tears sting her eyes as she looked away. He turned next toward the cockpit. His voice did not rise, but its weight pressed into every corner of the cabin. "Captain Stone, you abused the authority given to you, using it to enforce arrogance rather than justice. And you, Mr. Harris, chose silence where courage was needed. You are no longer in command of my aircraft." Stone's face reddened, his mouth opening, but Elijah's gaze froze him in place. Harris slumped, his youthful ambition crumbling under the truth of his failure. Finally, Elijah turned toward Langston, the man who had sparked it all, who still sat in 1A with his phone clutched in his hand, his arrogance stripped bare. "And you, Richard, you believed comfort entitled you to authority. You believed your prejudice was a whisper without consequence. You were wrong. What you thought was victory was illusion. An illusion always collapses." Langston said nothing. His lips moved, but no words came. The jet came to a halt. The engines wound down. Outside, the Swiss ground crew stood waiting. Elijah stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. His final words rang clear, like a sentence delivered in court. "Disembark. All of you. Your service, your seats, your illusions of authority end here." The cabin was still. No one moved at first, paralyzed by the weight of what had been spoken. Then Caroline rose slowly, her hands trembling as she gathered her belongings. Harris unbuckled in silence, his eyes fixed downward. Stone remained rigid for a moment longer, then finally stood, his pride breaking into resignation. Langston lingered in 1A, his face pale, his hand clutching the armrest. Elijah's eyes met his once more. With a shuddering breath, Langston rose, one by one. They moved toward the door, stepping into the cool Swiss morning. And in that silence, Elijah Cross remained seated, composed, the master not of vengeance, but of consequence. The air stairs clanged against the fuselage. the metallic sound cutting through the cabin like a final bell. Outside, Geneva's morning mist hung low over the tarmac, curling around the sleek body of the jet. The city beyond was waking up, unaware that inside this private terminal, an empire had shifted hands. Caroline Meyer descended first, her shoes clicking against the steps. Her posture remained professional, her chin lifted, but her eyes betrayed her. They shimmered with unshed tears, the weight of Elijah's words pressing down with each step. For 20 years she had built a reputation for poise, for discretion, for service without falter. And now, in a single flight, all of it had unraveled. She knew the news had already spread. Aviation was a small world, and stories traveled faster than jets. She had not just lost a seat or a position. She had lost her name. Mark Harris followed, his shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of guilt. He was young, still early in his career, and yet his silence had marked him forever. He had believed silence kept him safe, but now he understood it was the very thing that condemned him. Each step down the stairs echoed with that truth. Captain Gerald Stone came next, his descent heavy, his face pale with contained fury. Pride had carried him through decades of command, through storms and emergencies, through thousands of landings and departures. But pride could not shield him here. He had called a man son. He had dismissed his dignity as trivial. And now, stripped of command, he walked down the stairs not as captain, but as a relic, discarded by the very system he thought he controlled. Richard Langston lingered longer, his face drawn, his confidence shattered. He gripped his phone like a talisman, scrolling desperately through messages that offered no lifeline. The headlines were everywhere now. NovaSphere acquires Skylux. Elia Cross rebrands company with zero-tolerance policies. Investors buzz over bold move. His stomach churned as he realized what it meant. The man he had mocked, the man he had humiliated, now held the strings of power over every future negotiation he might attempt. Finally, he rose and descended, each step reluctant, as though hoping the ground would not meet him. Behind them all, Elijah Cross remained seated for a moment, the cabin now empty but for his steady presence. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The air was still heavy with the echoes of confrontation, but he felt no chaos inside himself. There was only clarity. He had acted not out of rage, but out of necessity. And now the true work began. He rose, collected his leather bag, and walked toward the door. As he stepped onto the stairs, the cool Swiss air washed over him. The breeze carried the scent of jet fuel, of wet pavement, of change. At the bottom of the stairs, a pair of black sedans waited, their drivers straight-backed and composed. Behind them, 2 members of NovaSphere's Geneva-based corporate security team stood silently, their presence understated but unmistakable. Caroline froze when she saw them. Her breath hitched as realization dawned. These were not escorts of courtesy. They were escorts of dismissal. One of the men stepped forward, his voice firm but polite. "Ms. Meyer, Mr. Harris, Captain Stone, you will be taken to the hotel. Your personal effects will be sent later. You will receive instructions regarding termination procedures. Please cooperate." Stone's face reddened. "Termination procedures. Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" The man's eyes did not waver. "I am speaking to former employees of Skylux Aviation." The words landed harder than Elijah's verdict had in the cabin. Caroline's tears finally spilled. Harris looked at the ground, unable to face anyone. Stone clenched his fists, his voice trembling with rage. You cannot erase 30 years of service with a press release and a security team. From the top of the stairs, Elijah's voice floated down, calm and absolute. I did not erase it. Captain, you did. The moment you chose prejudice over integrity, you ended your own command. I simply confirmed it. Stone turned sharply, his face contorted, but he found no words. Elijah stepped onto the tarmac, his stride measured, his presence commanding. He walked past the stunned crew without a glance, his eyes fixed on the waiting car. The security team directed Caroline, Harris, and Stone toward another vehicle, while Langston lingered by the stairs, pale and shaken. Elijah. Langston called suddenly, his voice cracking on the name. Elijah stopped, turned, and faced him. Do not think this ends me, Langston said, though his voice lacked conviction. I have influence. I have connections. You cannot dismantle me with a single deal. Elijah studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his tone quiet but sharper than any blade. Influence without integrity collapses. Connections without respect unravel. You will learn this soon. Langston's chest heaved, his words dying in his throat. Elijah turned again, sliding into the back seat of his car. The door shut with a soft thud, sealing the divide between the world that had humiliated him and the new world he had just built. The convoy pulled away from the terminal, the mist of Geneva curling around it. Inside the car, Elijah rested his head against the seat, finally allowing a breath of release. He thought not of vengeance, but of purpose. Skylux would become something new, a company not built on arrogance but on dignity, a company where no whisper of prejudice could dictate authority. His phone buzzed, a message from David Chen. Operations teams are moving swiftly. Staff have been notified. Press coverage is strong. The industry is already calling this a turning point. Elijah typed a reply. Good. Begin rebranding immediately. The name Skylux ends today. It will be Astrojet. He set the phone down, watching the streets of Geneva unfold outside the tinted window. This was only the beginning. The humiliation that had burned like fire hours earlier was gone, transformed into steel. He had not only reclaimed his dignity, he had reshaped the skies themselves. Behind him, on the tarmac, Caroline wept quietly in the back of a car. Stone seethed with impotent fury. Harris stared blankly into his lap, and Langston sat in silence, the full weight of collapse pressing down. The flight was over, but for each of them, the reckoning had only begun. 6 months later, a different Gulfstream cut through the clouds, its fuselage gleaming under the morning sun. The paint was new, sleek silver streaked with midnight blue, bearing a name no one in aviation could now ignore. Astrojet. Inside, the cabin reflected the rebirth. Gone were the beige leathers and mahogany trims of old Skylux. In their place, cool tones of silver and soft lighting created an atmosphere of clarity, of modernity. Even more striking than the design was the spirit that lingered in the air. Respect, precision, a sense of dignity woven into every detail. Elijah Cross sat in seat 1A, the very seat once used to humiliate him. But today, it was not a symbol of status. It was a reminder of purpose. His leather bag rested beside him, his tablet closed. He was not working through numbers or drafting acquisitions. He simply looked out the window at the expansive sky, his reflection calm, his eyes steady. The new lead attendant, a poised woman named Sarah Whitfield, approached with a genuine smile. Mr. Cross, We are ready for departure to Tokyo. Would you like something before we take off? Just water. Thank you. Sarah, Elijah replied, his tone warm but quiet. She placed the glass gently on the side table, then added, For your reference, we've confirmed you are the sole passenger on this flight, as requested. The crew roster is available on your tablet. All have completed Astrojet's advanced training program. She emphasized the last words softly, acknowledging the past without needing to speak it. Elijah inclined his head. Good. As Sarah moved back toward the galley, Elijah let his thoughts drift. The past 6 months had been relentless. Transforming Skylux into Astrojet was not merely a matter of paint and branding. It had required tearing out the rot that had festered deep within the company's culture. He had created the Astra Academy, a rigorous training program that went beyond technical skills. It covered implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, conflict resolution, pilots, attendants. Even mechanics were taught not just how to operate, but how to respect. Dignity was written into the DNA of the company now. He remembered the young junior attendant from that fateful Zurich flight, the one who had watched in silence, but with horror as her colleagues humiliated him. He had found her later, interviewed her himself. Today, she was a training supervisor at the academy, her story used as a living example of moral courage. He thought, too, of the Astra Foundation, the nonprofit he had seeded with 10% of Astrojet's profits. Its mission was clear scholarships and mentorship programs for women and minorities pursuing careers in aviation. Doors once closed would now open. Futures once denied would now be possible. The past crew had not fared well. Caroline Meyer never returned to aviation. Her name became synonymous with the story whispered across private terminals, the attendant who lost everything because of one catastrophic choice. She worked now in a hotel lounge in New Jersey, her smile still practiced but hollow, the weight of regret never far behind her eyes. Captain Gerald Stone had fought. Of course, he challenged the termination, appealed to the FAA, leaned on every favor his decades of service could call in. But the investigation confirmed Elijah's account, and his license was revoked permanently. Stripped of command, he ended up working as a dispatcher for a trucking company, his days of flying reduced to bitter memory. Mark Harris fled the country, taking a co-pilot job for a low-paying cargo airline in Southeast Asia. He flew aging planes over jungles and rivers, his dreams of prestige and command gone. He told himself he was still flying, but deep down he knew he had been grounded forever by his silence that day. And Richard Langston. His fall was the most spectacular. Elijah had not moved against him in anger. He had simply allowed NovaSphere systems to do what they did best: analyze, dismantle, and outmaneuver. Within weeks of the Zurich flight, Langston's empire began to crumble. Contracts evaporated, lenders pulled back, regulators circled, and then came the headlines: investigations into his practices, exposés detailing predatory takeovers and pension fund misappropriations. His name became poison. Langston sold his mansion, his cars, even his art. He moved into a small apartment in Chicago, his phone silent, his calendar empty. Once a man who boasted about victory in Seat 1A, he now sat alone in a chair worn thin, watching the rise of Astrojet on the news. His arrogance had collapsed into obscurity. For Elijah, none of their ruin brought joy. It was not about revenge. It was about consequence. Cause and effect. They had each made a choice, and choices always carry weight. A soft chime signaled the start of takeoff. The jet surged down the runway, lifted smoothly into the sky and leveled against the horizon. Elijah felt the familiar pressure of ascent, the engine's roar tapering into steady hum. He glanced at the seat beside him, once empty, now symbolic. It reminded him of that night in the Atlantic sky, when humiliation had burned in his chest. He thought of how easy it would have been to stew in anger, to lash out, to demand apologies that would mean nothing. Instead, he had chosen something harder. He had turned humiliation into transformation. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. His phone buzzed. A notification. A news headline. Astrojet's Respect in the Skies initiative sets new industry standard. The article praised the company's rapid turnaround, highlighting its training programs, its foundation, its cultural shift. Competitors were already imitating its model. Regulators were citing it as a benchmark. Elijah's face stared back at him from the screen. Calm, composed, visionary. The attendant returned to check on him. Everything comfortable. Mr. Cross. Elijah offered a faint smile. Yes, very. He turned back to the window. The horizon stretched endless, painted in blue and gold. The sky no longer felt like a battleground of humiliation. It felt like home. For Elijah, the journey was not just about reclaiming a seat. It was about redefining what power meant. Not domination, not arrogance, but dignity. A dignity that could not be taken by whispers or prejudice. A dignity that, once claimed, reshaped everything around it. As Astrojet soared toward Tokyo, Elijah allowed himself a final thought. The skies were no longer theirs. They were his, not for victory, but for justice, not for vengeance, but for truth. And in that truth, he had built something far greater than an airline. He had built a legacy. And so, from humiliation in Seat 1A to the creation of Astrojet, Elijah Cross turned a moment of prejudice into a movement of transformation. The crew who dismissed him lost not just their jobs, but their reputations. Richard Langston, the arrogant passenger, watched his empire collapse into ashes, and an airline once built on privilege was reborn with dignity at its core. This story is more than revenge. It is a reminder that every choice carries weight. A whisper of prejudice can shatter lives. A single act of silence can destroy a career. But one person's resolve can transform humiliation into justice, and justice into change. As you leave this story, ask yourself, how do you treat the people around you when no one is watching? Because sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one writing the future. If this story touched you, let it linger. Let it remind you to choose respect, to stand against discrimination, and to value dignity as the highest seat in any room. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. More stories are coming, stories that will challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark.